Zhang Qiao, Message from the Frontier. The sound of bugles has faded in the clear autumn air. Soldiers lean idly against the battlements on the watchtower. Spring breezes ruffle the grass on Zhao Jun's tomb as the sun sets over Liangzhou. Now the desert is no longer blocked by fighting. Travelers come and go across these open spaces. Peace with barbarians gathers like the river. Long may it flow towards the south. So we continue with poems from the last section of the 5-word regulated verse of the 300 Tang poems. And almost all of these poems are late Tang writers. And Zhang Qiao, the author of this poem, is no exception. This is the only poem by Zhang Qiao included in the anthology. I don't think he's a particularly relevant or important figure. From the biographical information at the end of the book, we know that he was from the area of modern-day Anhui, that is in the east of China, close to the coast, but not quite. And he passed the examinations in 871, so very late into the late Tang period, at the time that the dynasty was collapsing. And he had spent a time studying at Mount Yuhua, which is one of the 4 great Buddhist mountains of China, after the Huang Chao rebellion broke out, which was a rebellion that practically put an end to the Tang dynasty. After the rebellion was put down, the dynasty survived for a few years, but only in name. Real power had fallen into the hands of different warlords. So after this rebellion, Zhang Qiao returned to Mount Yuhua and spent the rest of his life there, reading, studying, and writing. So today's poem by Zhang Qiao, it's a bit of an unusual poem, I will say from the start. It's a frontier poem, which is a genre that we've encountered quite a lot in the anthology, but it makes an interesting twist to our expectations of a frontier poem. Only from reading the title, Message from the Frontier, what one would have expected before reading the poem is an anti-militaristic poem in the line of almost all traditional Chinese frontier poetry, a lament at the hardship of the soldiers in the frontier, maybe a letter sent by a soldier to his wife or to his relatives, telling them not to wait for him as he was inevitably going to die, and his bones were going to, whiten in the Taklamakan desert, that sort of thing. But this is quite the opposite, actually. So it's a frontier poem, but the poem is depicting peace, the achievement of peace at the frontier. So, and desires, wishes for the peace to last long into the future. Now, one curious thing of the late Tang dynasty, a lot of dynasties in China fell. When they fell, they generally had big internal conflicts, massive peasant rebellion, economic, social upheaval, excessive taxation, and so on. You could say that almost all dynasties in the imperial age enter a crisis in a certain period of their evolution, and they die of inner illness, you could say. But a lot of the times, the final catalyst for the fall of the dynasty, and sometimes not the final catalyst, but the provoker, is a foreign invader. So, for example, some dynasties fell to foreign invasions, like the northern and southern Song, or the Ming. But the Tang dynasty is one of those dynasties that did not encounter very heavy barbarian pressure in its last years. During its height, during the period of greatest power and expansion, the Chinese Tang dynasty did have to fight a very strong Tibetan empire. In its early days, a very strong Korean kingdom, Goguryeo in the northeast, and Turkish confederations in the north. But the thing is, in the late Tang dynasty, there was relatively little pressure from the frontiers, and after in the beginning of the late Tang, after some campaigns with disastrous effects on the Chinese against Tibetans and Uyghurs, which managed to take and sack the capital Chang'an at least twice. After those initial incidents. The thing is that the Tibetan Empire split. The Uyghurs didn't pressure much in the frontier, and foreign pressure practically disappeared. There were some campaigns in the late Tang, military campaigns that were successful in that, managed to pacify the situation. So indeed, the late Tang period is a period of external peace, although internal chaos and warfare is, just sprouting, just taking place at the time Zhang Qiao was composing this poem. So frontier poetry, but exaltation, praise, depiction of peace, of the attainment of peace at the frontiers with the barbarians. So in spite of this unusual take, it's still a frontier poem, and it includes many typical elements we find in those poems. A description, a quick picture of military life at the frontier. Not much of the landscape, but references to it, at least to the desert and the open spaces of the steppe, and some geographical references, or even a reference to Wang Zhaojun, which we'll comment in a minute. So as usual, let's go couplet by couplet. The sound of buckles has faded in the clear autumn air. Soldiers lean idly against the battlements on the watchtower. So the first couplet shows us a picture of the army at the frontier, but it also very quickly introduces the idea that the army is idle, that is, its warfare has, for some reason or other, stopped. And as the poem will show us later on, it's not just a little lull in the fighting, it's an effective apparently long-term peace that has been achieved. So bugles were like trumpets. They were an instrument used by the armies to move the soldiers about, but they are quiet. Just like the guns in a modern warfare movie or a novel, just as the guns have fallen silent, here in the frontier, the bugles have fallen silent. In the autumn air, no bugles are heard, and this oral impression is reinforced with a visual one in the second line. We have battlements and a watchtower, but the soldiers aren't manning it and prepared with weapon in hand. No, they're relaxing. Soldiers lean idly against the battlements. So there's no perspective of danger, of immediate danger, affecting the soldiers in the frontier. The second couplet moves further into the more generally descriptive and geographical. Spring breezes ruffle the grass on Zhao Jun's tomb as the sun sets over Liangzhou. We didn't mention it, the poem is set in autumn like many poems, but I don't feel a sad autumnal feeling to this poem because, the subject is relatively optimistic, relatively positive. Even though it's autumn, we have a spring breeze. So the spring breeze is ruffling the grass of Zhao Jun's tomb. Wang Zhaojun, was a mythical figure. Well, I think it was historical, but not most of the stories that were later developed in literature and in theatre about her. She was a woman who lived in the Western Han Dynasty, and she was sent, I think, by Emperor Yuan as a wife to one of the leaders of the northern barbarians, probably to the Shan Yu of the northern barbarians, and she lived in the north. She married barbarians. She had children. She died there, and she became very, very early on a symbol for Chinese culture trapped in barbarian lands, or at least for the tribute that the Chinese had to pay in exchange for peace at the frontier, the suffering of an individual woman, Chinese woman in a foreign land. And it was a pathetic image that lent itself easily to lots of poetry and drama. So over her grass the spring breezes blow, and they're evoking this tragic figure of a Chinese person in a foreign land dying there and having to live there. And the sun is setting over Liangzhou. So this locates the poem in a more specific place. So Liangzhou was one of the prefectures of the Tang Empire, and it was located in the Gansu corridor, in the very thin corridor that connects central China, classical area of Chinese civilization, with Central Asia, the area that under the Tang's most successful period was in the area of Anxi, the protectorate of the western regions. During the late Tang, this area became the frontier, actually, so because the western regions had been abandoned. So the sun is setting on this Chinese but frontier town, and probably further on, and definitely not probably in the view of the soldiers. The grasses are shaking over Qiao Jun's tomb. So these two images are just meant to evoke, I imagine, the frontier geography with two significant images: Qiao Jun's tomb and the province of Liangzhou. Third couplet. So the third couplet is the first one that really explains us what has been indirectly emphasized or pointed at in the first couplet, that peace has been achieved, has been arrived at with the barbarians. Now the desert is no longer blocked by fighting. Travelers come and go across these open spaces. So one of the immediate consequences of warfare in the frontier is closing of the frontier and the end of trafficking and merchants going to and from. But now we are at peace, and this desert area, beyond Gansu, we have the Taklamahan Desert, one of the most dangerous deserts in the world, I think. And then the steppe, which is not technically desert, but it's quite arid as well. So now in these big open alien spaces, merchants can come and go because peace has been attained. And this message is completely and very explicitly drawn out in the last couplet that summarizes the whole poem. Peace with the barbarians gathers like the river. Long may it flow towards the south. So it's a very nice image to synthesize the poem. Peace is like a river, a strong river that flows south, and may it continue to flow, and may it flow for long. So may peace last with the barbarians. So quite a nice poem, quite an original take on what would be usually expected of a frontier poem. And I also like the image at the end of peace like a river, flowing like a river. I think it's a very, very good image, and very, very visual and very effective.